America's most provocative talk show erupted into chaos last night when Mel Gibson faced off against the hosts of The View. Tensions soared as a single comment about Hollywood's establishment sparked an on-air confrontation that left the studio, audience stunned and the host scrambling to maintain control. What followed was an exchange that nobody expected. The studio lights gleamed off the polished set of The View as the audience settled into their seats, anticipation hanging in the air. Today's guest was none other than Hollywood veteran Mel Gibson, whose appearance had been the subject of intense speculation across social media. The actor and director sat composed in the guest chair, a slight smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the set, seemingly prepared for what would inevitably be a challenging interview. "Welcome back to The View," Whoopi Goldberg announced, her voice carrying an edge that regular viewers immediately recognized. "Our next guest is someone who's been at the center of numerous controversies throughout his career. He's here today to discuss his new film project, but we have some other questions as well. Please welcome Mel Gibson." The audience's applause was noticeably subdued, almost hesitant, as Gibson nodded appreciatively. He straightened his blazer and leaned forward slightly, making eye contact with each host in turn. "Thanks for having me, ladies. It's been a while since I've been in the hot seat here," Gibson said, his tone light, but his eyes alert. Joy Behar was the first to pounce. "Let's not dance around the elephant in the room, Mel. Your recent comments about wanting tariffs on foreign films have caused quite a stir in Hollywood. Many see it as xenophobic and isolationist. Care to explain yourself?" Gibson took a measured breath before responding, his calmness in stark contrast to the hostility directed at him. "I appreciate your directness, Joy. What I actually said was that American filmmakers and crew members deserve protection in a global market that often undercuts them with subsidized production. This isn't about xenophobia. It's about fair trade and supporting American workers." "But surely you understand how that sounds coming from someone with your history?" Sonny Hostin interjected, emphasizing the last word with raised eyebrows. The audience murmured, sensing the escalation. Gibson nodded slowly. "My past mistakes don't invalidate economic concerns that affect thousands of hardworking Americans in the film industry," he replied. "I've acknowledged my failures publicly and privately. I've apologized and worked to make amends. But today, I'd like to focus on the legitimate concerns of craftspeople who are losing their livelihoods." An uncomfortable silence followed as the hosts exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for Gibson's measured response. The actor continued, his voice gaining strength without raising in volume. "You know, it's interesting that in a show called The View, there seems to be very little tolerance for views that don't align with a particular narrative," Gibson observed, his statement hanging in the air like a challenge. Whoopi leaned forward, her expression darkening. "What exactly are you implying, Mr. Gibson?" "I'm not implying anything, Whoopi. I'm stating it directly. Hollywood prides itself on diversity, but that often doesn't extend to diversity of thought. When someone questions the established orthodoxy, they're immediately labeled and dismissed." The audience, initially silent, broke into scattered applause. Gibson looked momentarily surprised by the support but continued, "I've made mistakes, serious ones, and I've paid for them. But canceling people for their economic or political viewpoints doesn't advance conversation. It stifles it. So we're supposed to just forget everything you've said in the past?" Behar shot back, her voice rising. "Your comments weren't just political differences. They were deeply offensive to many communities." Gibson nodded soberly. "No, you shouldn't forget. Neither should I. And I haven't. But there's a difference between holding someone accountable and refusing to allow them to evolve or contribute to discussions that matter." The tension in the studio was palpable as a few more audience members applauded. The camera cut to Whoopi, whose expression had hardened into granite. "We'll be right back after this," she began, but Gibson raised his hand slightly. "Actually, if I could just finish my thought." "We need to break," Whoopi insisted, her voice firm. Gibson leaned back slightly, a flicker of something. Disappointment? Perhaps, or resignation, crossing his face. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Control the conversation. Control the narrative. The audience's reaction was immediate and unexpected. The applause grew louder, with a few people even standing. Whoopi's eyes widened momentarily before narrowing again. You want to talk about control? Let's talk about how you've manipulated this conversation to position yourself as some kind of martyr, she fired back, ignoring the producer's frantic signals to go to break. Gibson's response was quiet but carried throughout the suddenly silent studio. I didn't come here looking for martyrdom, Whoopi. I came here hoping for dialogue. There's a difference. The audience erupted into more applause, and several people stood up. The camera panned across their faces, some conflicted, others enthusiastic, in their support for Gibson's composure under fire. Sunny Hostin attempted to regain control, her voice cutting through the applause. Let's be clear about something. This show has always welcomed diverse perspectives, but there's a line between different viewpoints and harmful rhetoric. Gibson nodded. I agree completely, and I've crossed that line in the past. I'm not denying that. But today, I'm trying to discuss economic policy that affects American workers, and instead, we're rehashing my personal failings from years ago. Because those failings speak to your character, Behar interjected. They speak to my worst moments, Gibson corrected. Just as I imagine your worst moments speak to yours. The difference is, mine played out in public. The audience's reaction was immediate. Gasps followed by more applause. Something was shifting in the studio, a palpable change in atmosphere, as Gibson maintained his composure while the hosts became increasingly agitated. You know what I find interesting? Gibson continued, his voice still measured but gaining intensity. When other celebrities make mistakes, and many have, they're often given pathways to redemption. But certain viewpoints seem unforgivable, not because they're more harmful, but because they challenge powerful interests. Whoopi's expression darkened further as she leaned forward. And what powerful interests would those be, Mr. Gibson? His answer would change everything. The entertainment industry itself, Gibson said calmly, looking directly at Whoopi. There's an established orthodoxy in Hollywood that determines who gets work, whose projects get greenlit, and whose voices get heard. Question that orthodoxy, and suddenly you're dangerous. The studio fell silent. Even the most restless audience members seemed frozen, waiting for what would come next. That's a convenient narrative for someone who's faced consequences for their own words and actions, Whoopi countered, her voice laced with barely contained anger. Gibson nodded thoughtfully. It would be convenient if it weren't true. But ask yourself, how many films explore perspectives that challenge progressive orthodoxy? How many executives are willing to back projects that might make them social pariahs at the next Bel Air fundraiser? So this is about politics? Sunny interjected, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. No, Gibson replied firmly. This is about intellectual honesty, about acknowledging that we've created an environment where certain ideas aren't even allowed to be discussed. They're immediately labeled as dangerous or offensive without any actual engagement. The audience's reaction was impossible to ignore. More applause. Louder this time. Several people nodded vigorously. The camera caught a production assistant whispering urgently to a producer off stage. You're painting yourself as some kind of free speech warrior, Whoopi said dismissively. When the reality is... The reality, Gibson interrupted, his voice still measured but insistent, is that I've said terrible things in the past, things I regret deeply and have apologized for repeatedly. The reality is also that the same industry that rightfully condemned those statements seems incapable of extending forgiveness selectively, based entirely on political alignment. Behar leaned forward, her expression thunderous. So we're the hypocrites here? Is that what you're saying? Gibson shook his head. I'm not calling anyone a hypocrite. I'm pointing out a double standard that everyone sees but few are willing to acknowledge publicly. Because it doesn't exist, Whoopi exclaimed, her composure finally cracking. Then explain why certain celebrities can commit actual crimes, not just say offensive things, but commit crimes, and be welcomed back with open arms, while others remain pariahs for expressing unpopular opinions? Gibson asked, his gaze steady. The audience erupted again, this time with a mixture of applause and vocal reactions. Someone shouted, "He's right!" from the back row. "We need to take a break," Whoopi insisted, but Gibson wasn't finished. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, gesturing toward her. "When the conversation becomes uncomfortable, when it challenges the narrative, it's time for a commercial." Whoopi's expression hardened. "No, when a guest hijacks our platform to promote conspiracy theories, it's time for a break." "What conspiracy theory have I promoted?" Gibson asked, genuine confusion crossing his face. "I've simply pointed out inconsistencies in how different voices are treated. That's not conspiracy. That's observation." The audience's support for Gibson was becoming increasingly evident, with more applause following his statements. The dynamic in the studio had shifted dramatically from when he first sat down. "Let me be clear," Sonny cut in, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "This show has always welcomed diverse perspectives, as long as they stay within acceptable parameters," Gibson finished for her. "That's not fair," Bihar protested. "Isn't it?" Gibson challenged. "When was the last time you had a guest who fundamentally disagreed with your worldview and wasn't treated as morally suspect? When was the last time a conservative voice wasn't introduced with qualifiers and caveats?" The tension in the studio was electric. Several audience members were now standing, their applause thunderous. The hosts exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the audience's reaction. "Your past statements weren't just differences of opinion," Whoopi insisted, raising her voice to be heard over the audience. "They were hateful and harmful." "Yes, they were," Gibson acknowledged immediately, surprising her. "And I've apologized and sought to make amends. But today, we're not talking about those statements. We're talking about economic policies affecting American workers, and somehow we've ended up here again." "Because character matters," Behar insisted. "It does," Gibson agreed. "And part of character is the ability to acknowledge when you've been wrong. I've done that, have you? Have any of you ever acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, people you disagree with might have valid concerns, that they might not be motivated by hatred or ignorance?" The camera caught Whoopi's expression, a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She wasn't accustomed to losing control of her show, yet that was precisely what was happening. "You know, what I find fascinating," Gibson continued, leaning forward. "We claim to want unity in this country, yet we demonize half the population. We claim to value diversity, but only diversity that looks a certain way, not diversity that thinks a certain way. There's a difference between thinking differently and promoting harmful ideologies," Sonny countered. "And who decides what's harmful?" Gibson asked. "That's the central question. Who gets to draw that line? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like a very small group of people have appointed themselves the arbiters of acceptable thought." The audience's reaction was immediate and intense, the loudest applause yet, with more people standing. Something remarkable was happening in the studio. The energy had shifted dramatically, and the hosts appeared increasingly defensive. "We have an obligation to our viewers," Whoopi began. "To present diverse perspectives honestly and fairly," Gibson finished for her. "I couldn't agree more." The tension between them was palpable. Whoopi's eyes narrowed dangerously as she leaned forward. "Don't presume to tell me what my obligations are, Mr. Gibson," she said, her voice low and threateningly calm. Gibson held her gaze without flinching. "I wouldn't dream of it. I'm simply suggesting that obligations run both ways." The studio fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against everyone present. Then Gibson said something that would ignite an even bigger firestorm. "The most dangerous form of censorship isn't government censorship," Gibson said, his voice quiet yet somehow filling the entire studio. "It's self-censorship. When people become so afraid of the consequences of speaking their minds that they silence themselves. That's what's happening in Hollywood, in media, and right here, on this show." Whoopi's eyes flashed with anger. "Are you accusing us of censorship, Mr. Gibson?" "I'm suggesting that you've created an environment where only certain perspectives are welcome," he replied evenly, "where challenging the prevailing narrative comes with social and professional consequences. That's not censorship by force, it's censorship by intimidation." "That's absurd," Behar exclaimed. "We have conservatives on this show all the time." "And how are they treated?" Gibson asked. "Are they engaged with honestly, or are they set up as foils? Are their ideas taken seriously, or are they presented as curiosities to be dissected and dismissed?" The audience's reaction was immediate. Loud applause, with more people standing now. Something unprecedented was happening in the studio as Gibson continued to maintain his composure, while the hosts grew visibly more agitated. "You know what I think," Whoopi said, abandoning any pretense of neutrality. "I think you're using this platform to rehabilitate your image by playing the victim." Gibson shook his head slowly. "I'm not a victim, Whoopi. I've made mistakes, serious ones, and I've faced consequences for them. What I'm suggesting is that we need to be honest about the state of discourse in this country, about who gets forgiven and who doesn't, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced." "Nobody is silencing you," Sonny countered. "You're literally on national television right now." "After years of being blacklisted," Gibson pointed out. "And even now, look at how this conversation is going. I came to discuss economic policies affecting American workers, and instead, we're relitigating statements I made years ago, statements I've apologized for repeatedly." "Because those statements reveal who you really are," Whoopi insisted. Gibson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Do they? Or do they reveal who I was at my worst moments? Are you the same person you were 15 years ago, Whoopi? Would you want to be judged solely by your worst moments? Your biggest mistakes?" The question hung in the air. For a moment something flickered across Whoopi's face. A momentary hesitation. Perhaps even recognition. "We all evolve," Gibson continued into the silence. "We all grow. At least we should. But that requires humility on all sides. The humility to acknowledge when we've been wrong, and the humility to allow others the grace to change." The audience erupted into the loudest applause yet. Several people were now on their feet, and the energy in the studio had completely transformed. What had begun as a hostile interview had become something else entirely. A genuine, if uncomfortable, conversation about forgiveness, growth, and the state of public discourse. "You're very good at this," Whoopi said, a note of reluctant respect in her voice. "Turning the tables? Making us look like the intolerant ones?" "That's not my intention," Gibson replied. "My intention is to have an honest conversation, to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we've lost something important in our rush to condemn and categorize each other." "And what would that be?" Behar asked, her tone still challenging but less hostile now. "Our humanity," Gibson said simply. "Our ability to see beyond labels and categories to the complex, flawed, evolving human beings underneath. Our capacity for forgiveness, not just for others, but for ourselves." The studio was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, contemplative rather than tense. "I've made mistakes," Gibson continued. "Terrible ones. I've said things I deeply regret. But I've also tried to learn from those mistakes, to grow from them. Isn't that what we want? For people to acknowledge their failures and strive to be better?" "Of course," Sonny agreed, her tone softening slightly. But accountability matters too. Absolutely, Gibson nodded. But accountability without the possibility of redemption isn't accountability. It's punishment in perpetuity. And I have to wonder who that serves. The audience applauded again, and this time there was something different in their response. Not just agreement, but recognition. Gibson had managed to articulate something many of them had felt but couldn't express. "So what are you suggesting?" Whoopi asked, genuine curiosity finally breaking through her defensive posture. "That we start listening to each other again," Gibson replied. "That we approach our differences with curiosity rather than contempt. That we remember we're all works in progress, all capable of both terrible mistakes and meaningful growth." For the first time in the interview, a genuine smile crossed Whoopi's face. "That's a nice sentiment, but in practice..." "In practice, it's hard," Gibson acknowledged. "It's easier to condemn than to understand. Easier to dismiss than to engage. But nothing worthwhile is ever easy, is it?" The tension in the studio had transformed into something else. Not agreement, necessarily, but a kind of mutual recognition. The battle lines had blurred, if only momentarily. "Well, this certainly hasn't gone the way I expected," Whoopi admitted, a reluctant chuckle escaping her. "That makes two of us," Gibson replied with a small smile. As the segment drew to a close, something remarkable had happened. What began as confrontation had evolved into conversation. Still challenging, still uncomfortable at times, but genuine. The audience sensed it too, their final applause carrying a different quality. Appreciation not just for entertainment, but for authenticity. As Gibson stood to leave, Whoopi extended her hand. A small gesture, but significant. He took it, nodding slightly. "Thank you for the conversation," he said simply. "Come back any time," she replied, and though there was still a trace of wariness in her eyes, there was something else too. Respect. As Gibson walked off the set, the cameras captured something unexpected. Audience members approaching him, some reaching out to shake his hand, others simply wanting to speak. In that moment, something had shifted, not just in the studio but perhaps in the wider conversation. The View had lived up to its name in a way few expected, becoming a forum for genuinely different perspectives. Whether that change would last remained to be seen. But for one afternoon at least, the possibility of real dialogue had broken through the noise of perpetual outrage. The episode would go viral within hours, clips shared across social media not as examples of conflict, but as rare instances of authentic exchange across the deepening divides of American culture. For once, the headlines wouldn't be about who destroyed whom, but about an unexpected moment of connection in an increasingly disconnected world.